to this year's edition of History with Matt. Very excited to talk to you about a new and refreshing concept. A lot of times I talk about figures and events that are fairly well known. However, today I'm going to shed light on a series of events that you probably haven't really considered. I know I hadn't before I started researching this topic. Without further ado, let's get into how children helped the Soviet Union win World War II. So when you first think about the Second World War, you're thinking of battles, you're thinking of, major figures, all that fighting that's happening, and that is what fuels the war. You'd think so. However, those fighters and those citizens within the nations fighting, they need to eat, they need to have resources, they need to have homes. All throughout this process, you need to realize World War II was a very long event, well before the United States even got involved. Let's also take into consideration the greatest tragedy of the 20th century by some accounts, at least in terms of loss of life, and that is the Soviet Union. They had gone through a whole lot of tragedy, famine, war, in the 20th century. In the late 19-teens, early 1920s, we have the Bolshevik Revolution and the rise of communism in the Soviet Union. So with the rise of communism, you have a new leader at the head of the nation, Vladimir Lenin. And he had a very forward-thinking idea of what he wanted the nation to be. He envisioned a nation full of patriotic communists, but that did not exist yet, as it was a new ideology sweeping the nation. It was not the dominant or most popular ideology across the nation. Because of that, he wanted to start building it into young children so that they could grow up and be what he envisioned. He figured that the adults in the country, they can provide adequate amounts of support and resources for his end goal. However, it would really start with the children. You need to have them be loyal and patriotic and sympathetic with his cause. Essentially, what he did was, within the Communist Party in the Soviet Union, he created a subsection of it called the Komsomol. And the Komsomol was the youth wing of the Communist Party. Essentially, it gave representation to children and allowed them access into the inner workings of government. Within this program, you also have the Young Pioneer Organization. Now, this was for children who showed promise in being good young patriots. They were provided with an opportunity to attend camps, participate in activities, pretty much grow themselves in their love for their nation, love for Lenin, and love for the party. This is where they would not only learn ideology, but they would also practice certain things that would allow them to sympathize with the rest of the nation. Not every child was a part of this, of course. They needed to pledge their loyalty. They needed to go through certain prerequisites in order to be a part of it. Essentially, a farm system could arise for children to kind of be weaned into the party. During this time in Soviet history, most of the country was occupied as farmers in something called a kolkhoz, which was essentially a collectivist farm. Or they were collectivist farmers within the collectivist farms. A lot of the nation was working in what we call now a blue-collar job. It was not for the academics, it was more agriculture, factory work, and this is exactly what the young pioneers learned as well. Even within their schools, they were being taught pro-Lenin, pro-Soviet propaganda. They had to essentially thank Lenin and then later Stalin for the opportunity for them to become good Soviet citizens. So that's the pre-war propaganda and the build-up to World War II. Here we have a clash of titans. Prior to the Soviet involvement in World War II, there was a non-aggression pact between Hitler and Stalin. When this was breached, it caught the nation slightly off guard, although they were still apprehensive of Germany dating back to the First World War. There was a mass mobilization. The nation was moving away from the front lines. Resources were being moved into the hinterland, closer to the Urals. Due to this, there was a mass movement in workers. Not only were soldiers being called and drafted into the war effort, but people were having resources taken from them, killing them, or making their situation, quite dire. Because of this, there were a lot of jobs that needed to be occupied, many of which being agriculture. Children stepped up in a major way in producing grain, barley, potatoes, other type of crops that are native to or grown in the Soviet Union. They were also employed in the factory work, so there was something called the State Labor Reserve, which was implemented in 1940. With this, it was essentially drafting young men into factory labor. It wasn't very well desired, but it was something that needed to be done as more jobs were necessary in order for wartime preparation, which was kind of being anticipated at that time. Children were also called to fight, not extensively. There weren't 7-year-olds running around with guns and bombs and such, but 16, 17-year-olds, younger than the 18-year conscription limit. You also see, though, 14 and 15-year-olds wanting to fight but being turned away, kind of showing their loyalty to the Soviet Union and their desire to fight for their country. There was also a fun little article in a children's magazine. Essentially, it presented a situation in which 2 students were walking home from school and they were asked, "Did you learn your German?" And the children said, "No, I did not learn my German." And the person said, "Well, you could have used your German for good and spied on the German soldiers while you were out playing and presented information to the local authorities." This is one example of how espionage was encouraged among children. And finally, there was grave digging. This was entrusted to the young pioneers. Essentially, they had to dig graves for Soviet soldiers who had just died in battle. And the reason this is so important is because they also were entrusted with this information, which the party did not really want public to a lot of people to know how many people exactly were dying. So not only did they have to do this awful task, but they were entrusted with secret information, essentially. What happened as a result of this after the war? Well, there was a lot of trauma endured by the children who participated in this, as was the entire nation. This was a heavily traumatic event, and the sad thing about it all is the individual grieving process and the ability to process these emotions were not very heavily encouraged, as it was seen as a national event, a national tragedy, a national struggle to thwart off the Germans. If you were to grieve about this and you were to kind of express your emotions about what you had felt or endured, you were seen as being selfish and you were trying to take away from the national cause. So because of this, there was a lot of suppression of your emotions. There was also a lot of rationalization about why you did what you did. Even though you might have lost your childhood, you might have lost your entire family, it was all for a greater good. As you can imagine, there was a lot of mental health illness coming out of this time, as PTSD, something that wasn't very heavily known about or researched, definitely manifested itself into participants of the war during this time. As far as how the workforce and education looked after the war, prior to the war, heavy emphasis was placed on education. However, after the war and the years following, there was a large stream of young men going into factory work and not finishing high school. High school capacity did not reach 100% as was pre-war until the mid-1950s. So as we can see, there was a shift away from education and more toward manufacturing as to compensate for the losses during the war. That all is essentially how children helped fight, work, and win World War II for the Soviet Union.